Hi folks. I just wanted to read a little story to you today from David Paulides' Missing 411 books. Hopefully it doesn't get a little angry at me. I'm going to read the Dennis Martin case to you. I think it's a very popular case. It strikes the hearts of a lot of people, and it's very peculiar in its circumstance and some of what the witnesses saw. So I just want to read that to you. Not the best narrator ever, so you'll have to bear with me here. Dennis Lloyd Martin, missing 6/14/1969, 4:30 p.m., Spencefield, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Age at disappearance, 6 years. Last seen wearing a red shirt and pants. The facts behind Dennis's story come directly from newspaper accounts, NPS documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act request that I initiated, and from a personal interview that I conducted with Mr. Martin at his residence, and Dwight Mccarty, the retired NPS ranger, also at his residence. Another investigator and I have also spent many days in the area where Dennis disappeared, attempting to understand the terrain and where the associated possibilities of what really occurred. Dennis Martin was vacationing at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park with his father, William Martin, grandfather, Clyde Martin, and his old brother, Douglas, 9 years old. They had spent the night of June 13th at a cabin at the Russell Field Shelter, 2 miles west of Spencefield. On June 14th, they hiked to Spencefield and spent the day playing in the meadow. Spencefield sits off the divide of Tennessee and North Carolina and is part of the Appalachian Trail. The field is grassy and runs in an east to west direction, with the north drainage going into Tennessee and the south going into North Carolina. As William and Clyde Martin were sitting on the grass with Dennis and Doug, 2 brothers, another family met them in the meadow and asked whether they could join their boys in playtime. One of the more coincidental parts of this case, this other family was also named Martin. As both Martin clans were sitting on a grassy spot just to the southwest of the Anthony Creek trailhead, the William Martin boys and the 2 other young Martin boys were playing in the field and sneaking up to the adults. It was a great atmosphere for the children to enjoy a national park setting. At one point, the boys decided to split up and play hide and seek. Dennis was last seen on the Tennessee side of the field, 50 feet from where Clyde and William were sitting. After 3 to 5 minutes of not seeing Dennis, Mr. Martin became concerned and began calling out loud for this boy. But there was no answer. Clyde Martin saw his son's concern and got up and started to join the search. It was approximately 3:30 p.m., and William Martin's life was about to change forever. During the next several hours, the Martins, rangers, volunteer searchers, and various other volunteers covered every trail in the immediate area. They searched behind every plant and tree on the field. Dennis Martin had vanished. According to a July 21st, 1969 article in the Knoxville News-Sentinel, the Harold Key family was visiting a region 5 to 7 miles from where Dennis Martin disappeared the same day, sometime between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m. The Key family was in the area downhill from where Dennis disappeared in a region known as Sea Branch Creek near Rowan's Creek in Cades Cove. The Keys had asked park rangers where they could go to see a bear and were directed to that location. The family exited their car and walked 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile uphill when they heard an enormous, sickening scream. The group walked 200 additional yards, and Mr. Key's son had just told Mr. Key that he had heard a bear somewhere in front of them. In an article on the same date in the Maryville Alcoa Times, Mr. Key states, "But it wasn't a bear. It was a man hiding in some bushes. He was definitely trying to hide from us." Mr. Key stated at the time that he didn't realize a boy was missing. Mr. Key read about the disappearance of Dennis Martin and then called the FBI 2 days later. At approximately 8:30 p.m., heavy rainstorms had moved into the national park and were greatly hampering search efforts. There was an estimated 2.5 inches of rain before midnight, rain that continued almost non-stop for 2 weeks. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was starting to initiate one of the largest searches in the history of the National Park Service, and they were starting to call for major reinforcements. June 15th, Sunday. National Park Service personnel searched all major drainages in the area of Spencefield. 30 Boy Scouts on an outing were used as searchers along with 51 Ranger students who were on a field trip in the area. Special approval was requested from Tony Stark, the regional chief of visitor protection, to hire a helicopter to transport equipment and establish a base camp at Spence Field. This was approved. Various North Carolina rescue squads were contacted and started their response. 2 Huey helicopters from the Air Force were requested and dispatched. 40 Special Forces Green Berets from the 3rd Army headquarters in Fort Benning, Georgia, were requested and dispatched. Remember that all of this this was all in process less than 24 hours after Dennis disappeared. 40 additional Green Berets would arrive later in the week. After reviewing dozens of National Park Service missing persons cases, I have never found one that came close to the immediate massive response for searchers as was requested in the Dennis Martin case. I applaud the effort and the response, but it was almost as though someone knew that this case was going to be different. It was going to be one of the most difficult in the history of the National Park Service. In researching hundreds of missing people, I have never seen this level of response for someone going missing in less than 24 hours. The fact that Green Berets were dispatched almost makes it seem as though they were up against something very unusual and someone knew it. It is a very rare event in missing person cases when special forces are dispatched. June 16th, Monday. A grid search of Spence Field was conducted. Rescue squads were being organized and given assignments. The Tennessee Air National Guard sent 17 men to Cades Cove. Many of the military personnel were calling for assistance without any prompt from search personnel. A heliport was established at Cades Cove to accommodate the air traffic supporting the search and rescue. Total force for June 16th was 300 National Park Service rescue squads, National Guard, volunteers, and student foresters. The next 4 days showed more intensive searching and a huge interest in assisting the public and the military. The number of searchers swelled to almost 800 on June 20th. On June 21st, the searchers numbered 1,400. The area around Spence Field was saturated. Drainages were searched inch by inch. Armed Special Forces personnel were looking for tracks, broken twigs, anything leading towards evidence of where the boy may be. It was at this point that the Chief Ranger contacted the media to advise public that no more searchers were needed. They were reaching a saturation and support point, which they could not accommodate. It was from this date forward that the number of searchers started to diminish. On June 24th, the National Park Service had a meeting with FBI Special Agent Jim Reich. The circumstances of the disappearance of Dennis Martin were explained to the agent. It was unclear per the National Park Service reports why the FBI agent arrived or who called the agency for assistance. There were no reports in the Freedom of Information Act documents stating what was discussed in this meeting or any documents outlining why the FBI was on site. Almost everything about the FBI's involvement was absent from National Park Service reports. On June 27th, Mr. Ed Crabtree, one of William Martin's neighbors in Knoxville, telephoned Tennessee Senator Howard Baker and asked for 300 additional federal troops to search for Dennis. The Coast Guard had committed 2 boats to Fontana Lake to search for any possible evidence, even though the lake was outside the park boundary and was miles away. On June 29th at 5 p.m., a meeting was held with the Martins, National Park Service personnel, and the FBI with the National Park Service posing the question which way the search would go from here. The FBI stated that absent any evidence of a kidnapping, the FBI could not launch a full-scale investigation, but they would continue one agent on site to monitor activity. That one agent was Jim Reich. The National Park Service told the Martins that they were willing to continue the search for 30 to 60 or 90 days, with 3 of the best Park Service's men. Dwight Mccarty was one of the personnel they committed. At 6 p.m., the search and rescue operation on Spence Field was officially closed down. A total of 13,240 man-hours were expended on the search for Dennis and 200 helicopter air hours. Mr. Martin was a draftsman for an architectural company and took weeks off work to assist with the search for his son. He was a man possessed by finding the boy. The amount of guilt that poor man must have felt would bring tears to anyone's eyes. He gave several interviews during and after the formal search. He was convinced that Dennis was abducted, but he couldn't convince the FBI or the local FBI had orders not to be involved. It was unclear what path the FBI was taking or the motivation or reason for its interest in this case. The National Park Service and the FBI did conduct interviews on many peripheral issues associated with the disappearance of Dennis. One of the more interesting and unusual interviews was with Harold Key of Carthage, Tennessee. One of the fascinating parts of this interview was that Mr. Key had volunteered to come to the park and meet with investigators. This did not happen. FBI agent Jim Reich intercepted Mr. Key and met him away from the park to have a debriefing. Mr. Key later told the press that he was near Rowan's Creek in the Sea Branch area with his family when they heard an enormous, sickening scream. The newspaper stated that a few minutes later he saw a rough-looking man stealthily in the woods near where he had heard the scream. He did not know the boy was missing until the next day, and at that point he contacted authorities. Park officials discounted the likelihood that this sighting was involved in disappearance because they felt it was too far from the point Dennis disappeared. They wouldn't even go to the area and investigate. One interesting side note to this observation is that Mr. Key's son has stated to another newspaper that he had heard or seen a bear in this same area, just as they saw someone or something darting between the trees. This seems a bit too coincidental. Dwight Mccarty was a National Park Service ranger at the time and participated in the search. Many years later, McCarter did give an interview about the event and specifically addressed the scream and sighting near Rowan's Creek. McCarter stated that Sea Branch is downhill from the location that Dennis disappeared, and it was his opinion that a physically fit man could carry a small boy between the 2 points. Nobody ever did address the huge scream that was heard. I did meet and interview McCarter on this point, and will address this issue later. On July 17, 1969, the National Park Service received a letter from the Esp Research Associates in Little Rock, Arkansas. Harold Sherman, the president of the organization, authored the letter. Mr. Sherman had some notoriety at the time for authoring several books and being accurate on his premonitions. The following letter was in the pages of documents sent from the Freedom of Information Act request. Mr. Sherman wrote an extensive letter that defined an area where Dennis may be located. The last 3 paragraphs of the letter are very discomforting. I am impelled to ask you if you know whether or not there have been or are any questionable characters in this region. Camping out in the wild in this area, like hermits, squatters, such an individual may not be connected with the boy's disappearance at all, but I feel that a sex maniac, so-called, does exist in the vicinity and could have trailed the boy. I hesitate to write anymore as my conscious mind is trying to reject such a feeling. I see something red and something being carried or dragged. Are there any caves in the vicinity? A stream may even run through it or part of it. I am always tormented when impressions come to my conscious mind trying to tell me that they couldn't possibly be true. But I get a feeling of sudden panic on the part of Dennis. What happened to him occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and he could not or did not cry out. He seems to be struck down by something. The area is rugged. As a reminder, Dennis was wearing a red shirt, and there are mines in the area where Harold Key and his family made their observation. On July 21st, 1969, the Knoxville Journal ran an article titled "Foul Play Suggested in Martin Boy Mystery." The paper had a formal interview with Harold Key. The article had many more details than were available through the National Park Service reports. Mr. Harold Key is a highway engineer, and his cousin is Baxter Key, who is an attorney general for the district. It was his cousin who convinced him to make his information public. Key stated that his family went to Cades Cove, an area below the region where Dennis Martin disappeared. They were there the afternoon the boy disappeared. Key stated that the family went looking for bears. The family parked their car and started to hike. Key stated, "My wife and daughter did not go far with us. We had gone half a mile or so when we heard an awful scream that sounded like someone in trouble. There was a stream there. As we were going up to it, one of my boys said, 'Look, Daddy, there's a bear.' I looked. It wasn't a bear. It was a man. I didn't get a good look at him because he seemed to be trying to stay hidden behind bushes." Later in the article, Key explains that the scream they heard. He described the sound as they heard as one long, loud, painful scream. As a former 20-year law enforcement veteran, I'd like to know what transpired when the FBI interviewed Mr. Key away from the park, but it appears that we will never know. The FBI has refused my Freedom of Information Act request, on this case, and the National Park Service either never wrote a report or failed to supply the report to my Freedom of Information Act in regards to the interview with Mr. Key. What was it about the appearance of the subject that the Keys observed that caused their son to believe they were witnessing a bear? I find it nearly impossible that the National Park Service investigators never wrote a report about the interview with Mr. Key. This was probably one of the most important developments in the disappearance of Dennis, and the National Park Service is claiming that they never documented this interview. Unbelievable. The idea that a witness would mistake a hairy bear for a human doesn't make a lot of sense unless the human was very hairy or they were wearing a shaggy large coat. In a National Park Service document titled Appendix F, under Suggestions, there is the following paragraph. On June 26, Carson Brewer of the Knoxville News Sentinel called and forwarded a suggestion received from a lady telling searchers to start looking in trees and treetops and stop looking on the ground. There was no other explanation. You will read about a missing girl later in this book that disappeared and was found high in a tree. A coincidence? There were several letters in a National Park Service file about the observation made by the Key family. Mr. Martin was quite upset at one point because the National Park Service went public with the Key family observation and hadn't informed him of the finding or of the FBI interview away from the park. Mr. Martin met with Mr. Key and heard firsthand the story and felt that the FBI and National Park Service had misinformed the press of the actual facts of the observation. That letter is in the file. Mr. Martin also felt that the FBI and National Park Service were purposely trying to keep the Key family observation from him. In the summer of 2011, I made a special trip to Tennessee to visit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, to observe locations of this event where people have disappeared, and to interview people who were witnesses. On a Sunday morning in August 2011, I went to the Martin residence in Knoxville. This was the same residence that was listed in wanted posters in 1969. The Martins had never moved and never changed their phone number. Another investigator and I had knocked on the front door, and I immediately recognized Mr. Martin as he came to the door. The man was still exceptional in physical condition and very recognizable. Mr. Martin answered the door and explained that I was a researcher, investigator, and writer working on his son's case for the last 3 years, and I wanted to ask him a few brief questions. I also stated that I deeply admired him for his refusal to give up the search for Dennis. It was a great effort on his part. Mr. Martin very politely stated that his family has lived with the disappearance for a lifetime and has tried not to talk about it. I explained I had traveled from California and only wanted to ask a very few questions. Mr. Martin now closed the front door and stepped out onto the porch. I asked Mr. Martin how far he was from his son on Spence Field when he disappeared. He stated that he could have thrown a rock and hit Dennis where he was hiding. He was no more than 50 feet away behind a few bushes. He reminded me that Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt, a shirt that was never found. I asked if Dennis's brother Doug had seen or heard anything strange while he was hiding. Mr. Martin stated that he had not. I told Mr. Martin that I was familiar with the statements made by Mr. Harold Key in the sighting of the area of Sea Branch and Rose Creek. Mr. Martin stated that he eventually got to speak with Mr. Key and was told things that you won't read in newspaper. He stated that he was so concerned that he and a National Park Service fire prevention officer hiked from Spence Field to the area of the Key sighting in 90 minutes. They didn't find anything, but they did prove that the hike could be made in the time frame of when Dennis disappeared and the Key family sighting. I asked Mr. Martin what Mr. Key had told him that was not in the papers. Mr. Martin stated that the Keys had thought they saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline carrying something on his shoulder. I again asked Mr. Martin to explain what he just stated. I was in shock. Mr. Martin again stated that the Keys had seen, in brackets here it says, the paper originally stated that the son thought they heard or saw a bear, and later reported the sighting as a dark-figured man running along a ridge carrying something on his shoulder. I asked Mr. Martin why the news and the Park Service had never reported this information. Mr. Martin stated he didn't know. I asked Mr. Martin if he felt that the Park Service was withholding information from him. He paused at this point. Mr. Martin stated that the head of the Park Service was a mere figurehead, and there were times information flowed smoothly and other times it did not. It appeared that Mr. Martin was contemplating saying something additional, so I again asked if there was something else I should know. Mr. Martin hesitated several seconds, was looking at the ground, and slowly raised his head to look at me and stated, "Do you know Jim Reich?" I stated yes, he was the lead FBI agent on several of the missing children cases in the mountains around the time Dennis disappeared. Mr. Martin stated, "Do you know he committed suicide?" I was speechless for several seconds. I asked him if he had felt that the suicide had something to do with the cases of missing children. He stated that he didn't know. Many weeks after meeting with Mr. Martin, I read what I had written and reviewed my notes of the interview with Mr. Martin. It was my opinion, and the opinion of the second researcher who was present, that Mr. Martin's statement that the head of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was a mere figurehead was important. It appeared that he was implying that another administrator somewhere else in the National Park Service system was dictating the orders, and the superintendent was barking them out. The real question is why the National Park Service and the FBI were not being open and honest with Mr. Martin. Why be evasive? What was it about Dennis's disappearance that caused the federal government to withhold information from the Martinses? It would appear that the FBI and the National Park Service didn't want the information from the Key family made public, specifically the part about seeing something being carried on the individual's shoulder. This information is not in any official documents that were forwarded to me. One of the last two items I asked William Martin was what he believed happened to his son, and were there any other strange events in conjunction with this case that were never reported. Mr. Martin stated that he believes that someone took his son off the mountain. He says that there was no way his son could have gotten away as far as he did without people finding him. In my years interviewing people under a multitude of circumstances, that was one of the hardest face-to-face meetings I've ever had. Mr. Martin's eyes were watery. I had tears in mine. I shook his hand and told him he did everything possible to find his son. I knew it, and his son would have been proud of his father's effort. I thanked William Martin for his time. I walked to our car, shaking and teary-eyed. If you were Dennis Martin, you would have been very proud of the intensity and effort William Martin placed on getting him back. The man hiked valleys and stayed with the search long after everyone else gave up. He was a man consumed with finding his boy. It appeared to me that he had a very good handle on politics of search efforts made by certain groups. William Martin should forever be commended for the effort he made in finding Dennis. He should be admired. The more I dug into this case, the more questions seemed to pop up. In October of 2011, I had developed more questions than answers and decided to again return to the park and attempt to interview Dwight Mccarty, retired National Park Service Ranger and author of Lost, a Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue. Dwight's book was about his work recovering missing people in and around the area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was also about his failure in finding some of those missing. Dwight Mccarty retired from the National Park Service as one of the premier trackers ever to walk the park. His knowledge is vast, and his tracking skills probably one of the best in North America. Another researcher and I found Dwight at his residence just outside park boundaries. He was working on a car for his son when we walked up to his garage. We introduced ourselves as researching a book on missing people and asked if he wouldn't mind answering a few questions about his years of tracking. Dwight stated, "Sure." I started our conversation with Dwight explaining that we had interviewed Dennis Martin's father and that he had given us specific insight that was not found in any other public documents. I told Dwight that I was specifically interested in the Key family observation at Maroons Creek, where they saw someone darting between trees carrying something over his shoulder. Dwight started his response by explaining that he felt that it was very possible that a man could carry a boy between the point Dennis disappeared at Maroons Creek location at the time frame of the disappearance and the observation made by the Keys. I asked why the FBI and the National Park Service downplayed the sighting. Dwight stated that it was the FBI that told the public and the National Park Service that this wasn't feasible and to discount the event. He stated that the FBI knows nothing about people moving through the woods and time frames of possibilities, yet they told everyone involved in the Key family sighting was not relevant. Dwight went into an explanation of how he has made the walk from Spence Field to the area of Maroons Creek and knows for a fact that this can be accomplished in the time allotment that was made from when Dennis went missing until the Keys made their observation. I asked Dwight what he thought had made the sickening scream heard by the Keys. He stated it might have been Dennis. I advised Dwight that the description of the scream by the Keys appears to be too loud for a small boy to have made. There was no response. I asked Dwight if he and other rangers were armed when the Dennis Martin appearance occurred. He stated no. The vast majority of National Park Service rangers were not armed until the 1970s. I then asked whether he had thought It was odd that the Green Berets came into the park, set up their own communications, and went out into the woods armed. Dwight stated that he did think it was a little strange, but he also stated that it was the military. Then he hesitated and stated that when the National Guard has assisted in the past, they were not armed. He stated that the Green Berets really acted on their own and did not interact with the National Park Service. I asked Dwight why one of the children of the Keys would first state that he observed a bear, and then his father stated they saw a man. Dwight hesitated for several minutes and then said that in and around the park there are wild men. He stated that there is more than one. They are hairy, dirty, and one even had an old bear skin that he wore. Dwight was careful with his words, but did state that these men lived in the wild and were essentially living off the land in and around the park. I asked if he thought Dennis was taken by a wild man. He stated that at the time he really gave it little thought. The only wild man he knew in the park at the time lived at the other end near the Cataloochee Valley and didn't venture into the area where Dennis disappeared or the area of the Cades Cove at the bottom of Roan's Creek. Dwight Mccarty made it clear that the wild men he was speaking about were humans who decided to live in the wild. They had little contact with humanity, and they appeared, as the name implied, wild and unkempt. This was the first, last, and only time I've ever heard anyone mention wild men inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Case summary. Dennis Martin avoided the efforts of over 50 county search and rescue teams that converged on the park to find him. The U.S. Green Beret Special Forces had almost 80 personnel at the park for 10 days searching for the 7-year-old boy. They couldn't find him. Canine units from across America responded with bloodhounds and German shepherds. They couldn't sniff him out. The list of emergency personnel responding and assisting on this event ran 3 pages, single-spaced, on a National Park Service document. The response was phenomenal. The Dennis Martin incident should be a case study every search and rescue commander reviews. Many elements of this event, the initial response, the inhibition of the search by the rain, the organization of the search resources, federal law enforcement's response, the organization of the law enforcement investigation, the decision to terminate the search, and the subsequent long-term investigation should be analyzed and understood for their effectiveness or lack of effectiveness. I do not believe that more resources and more searchers would have changed the outcome of this event. There was something different about this search. If search and rescue leaders would open up their minds, understand that they don't have all the answers, and allow new ideas and strategies to enter their minds, a different method for addressing search and rescue could take place. The best method for changing a paradigm is through brainstorming sessions with enlightened leaders not involved in daily issues related to search and rescue, but rather people who can see the issue from a different perspective. Decisions about searching, how people could move through the woods, distances people could travel, etc., those opinions should be rendered by people living and working in the parks, not by the FBI. It appeared from Mr. Martin's statements that some type of behind-the-scenes politics was taking place, and that the park superintendent wasn't really in charge. Excuse me. In all of the search and rescues I've read, it's a rare event when special forces are used to find a child outside of the Great Smoky Mountains. The National Park Service literally turned much of the search and rescue for Dennis over to special forces. As is described in a June 20th, 1969 article in the Rock Hill Herald, the search can be compared to a military operation complete with a headquarters, a commanding general, squad leaders, and a mass of privates. This was a truly unique search. It used resources never before used to look for a small boy. What is more amazing is that the Green Berets entered the park, armed themselves, and then conducted a search without coordinating efforts with National Park Service trackers. They had their own communication system and their own camp, and they seemed to want to work independently and away from others. Very unusual. Park officials seem to have used every available resource to find Dennis, yet the efforts failed to find one single clue of his whereabouts. This fact should tell us something. In one of the more surprising twists of the search and rescue, it was discovered that the Park Service closed Cades Cove Loop Road for 3 days without explanation. The area was closed just after the Key family had made their observations near Sea Branch and Roan's Creek and Cades Cove. There's nothing in the documents I received explaining why the cove was closed. I believe that one change in the strategy could have altered the course of events in this search and rescue. Once leaders understood that the Harold Key family had a viable sighting, search and rescue commanders could have immediately expanded the perimeter 10 miles into Cades Cove and searched outside in, starting at the farthest point out from where Dennis was last seen and searching toward where he was seen by the Key family. I actually believe this happened, and that's why Cades Cove was closed. The real reason is, why wouldn't search and rescue commanders admit to having expanded the perimeter and to including Roans Creek and Sea Branch in the search area? I believe that the Green Berets were given this task, and this is why they had special communications that did not interact with National Park Service radios, and why their helicopters were landing at the cove. Everything the Green Berets did, what they saw, and how they proceeded was veiled in secrecy because of the lack of communication between their group and the National Park Service. I'm very interested in what transpired in the meeting between FBI agent Reich and Harold Key away from the park. Was his story buffered in some way? Mr. Key's son stated that he had heard and observed a bear, which was later changed to his father saying that he saw a human. A bear normally walks on 4 feet, not 2. What was the difference in the sighting that changed the description? Why wasn't the fact that the Keys saw someone carrying something over his shoulder in any NPS document, any newspaper article, or in any government documents ever released? Dwight Mccarty confirmed that he knows of this fact and didn't know why it was never made public. It almost sounds as if Special Agent Jim Reich knew the Keys had an unusual event happen to them, so unusual that he didn't want them coming to the park. He met them 20 miles away. It's obvious that the FBI and park officials never wanted this information made public. But why? The FBI still does not want this information released, and I believe that this is why they refused my Freedom of Information Act request for documents on the Martin case. Even if Dennis was abducted, wasn't it in the best interest of the park and the FBI to conduct a full-fledged investigation and advise public of the threat that existed? The park and nearby communities generate over $700 million for the state and nearby cities. Therefore, maybe the National Park Service and local communities didn't want specific information released. Major concern that I've developed over the years I've investigated this case is what is in the FBI file and why won't they release it? What did FBI Agent Jim Reich document that could be so damning after 50 years after the event that our government cannot tell the public? The information that Agent Reich accumulated through his investigations of child disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountain area are part of a very large file of hundreds of cases that the FBI has accumulated over the years that have no doubt made their way to the profiling unit and are now sitting in a large filing cabinet. Imagine you read a storyline like this. Little boy disappears, meadow in National Park, within 50 feet of parents. Searchers scour park for weeks with no results. 80 armed Green Beret special forces brought into the park to search. Strange screams reported by family in the park. Something similar to a dark-figured man is seen running through the forest park carrying something over his shoulder. Psychic tells of seeing boy in a cave-like setting. Another psychic tells of seeing a boy possibly in a tree. No trace of the boy ever found. 11 people have disappeared under unusual circumstances at or near this park. The lead FBI agent on this case commits suicide. Doesn't this sound like something someone would make up for a movie? Unfortunately, all the elements listed above are fact. Most of the people involved in this case have retired or passed away. Mr. Key died in 2010. I would like to know why there is not one mention in any Park Service document about the interview with Mr. Key, or why there's no mention of someone carrying something over his shoulder in the woods. Does this seem like some type of censorship? It almost sounds as though the FBI and National Park Service was trying to manage Mr. Key's statement before it was heard by the media and Mr. Martin. I did file a second Freedom of Information Act request asking for a review of the file to ensure that Mr. Key's interview and statement weren't missed in their original search. The Park Service responded stating they did not have any such document. I would gladly assist any congressional investigation into the National Park Service and its censorship of documents and its failure to meet Freedom of Information Act requirements. Let's pray that the Martin family has happiness and peace in their lives. And that's it for the Dennis Martin case and Missing 411. So I've actually bookmarked this one because it's one of the more interesting cases with a lot of details. It's pretty messed up. If you have any children or young siblings, even the thought of anything like that happening is quite frightening. So you might be saying, oh, why is a guy with a Sasquatch channel talking about missing 411? Well, I personally feel the two are linked, especially with wilderness disappearances. In a lot of these cases, similar to this case is a good example. People will see what they say is a hairy man running through the bush, or children that have been actually recovered that have gone missing said they were taken by the fuzzy man, or they were running away from the gorilla or something like that. So that's very peculiar. Almost sounds like Sasquatch. So if this is in fact a Sasquatch, it would make sense if the government's trying to, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but cover it up, that they would close off that cove area there, and the military would basically search and destroy animals, assuming they already know that these animals are involved. It's been reported, people claim to have these special, insiders that claim that, they're part of special forces teams that go out to these areas where people go missing, and they basically eliminate the Sasquatch because the Sasquatch have started feeding on people and killing them, killing and eating. So this is very interesting for me. It kind of links some things together, but nobody really knows what actually happened. That's my kind of take on it. So it's a little bit messed up that if this is all true, this is all being covered up, and it would explain why that FBI agent committed suicide. It'd be really hard to handle all of these missing children and knowing what's happening to them and keeping it from their parents. It'd be really messed up. But yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed that, and I hope David Paulides doesn't get too angry at me for reading one of his cases, but these books are really good. I totally recommend you buy them. I bought the whole case set. There's a new one out called Missing 411 Hunters. I'll be buying that, and I think on May 15th, his documentary, Missing 411, the movie, is going to be released, so I'm considering ordering it. The shipping to Canada is pretty cringeworthy, but I might order it anyways, because this stuff is just addictive. Be careful reading these books. They can get pretty depressing, so it's nice to have some kind of lighter material to read in between. But yeah, so if anybody's actually watching this, I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good one.